If I had known what that motel would do to us, I would never have stepped foot in it. There was something about that place that didn't belong to our world, something that tried to trap us, and almost did. Now, even far away, the feeling of being watched still follows me. But the truth is, that night, none of us had any idea of the nightmare waiting for us behind the walls of that abandoned building. I'm Brian, and along with my two best friends, we decided to explore the so-called haunted motel that had become a legend in our town. The idea seemed absurd, but we were always up for a good adventure. The road there was deserted, long, and seemingly endless. I drove slowly, trying not to let the stories I'd heard over the years get to me. In the seat next to me, Lucas fiddled with the flashlight, while Nick sat in the back, playing with his phone. The silence in the car was heavy, and I could feel a part of me hesitate with every mile. The first time we'd heard about the motel was years ago, and since then, it had become a kind of local dare. A place no one should go to, but everyone wanted to visit. Now that we were just minutes away, the excitement I'd felt at first started to shift into something darker. The abandoned road was lined with tall trees swaying with the wind, casting shadows across the pavement as if trying to reach out and grab us. Finally, the motel appeared in front of us. We stopped the car and stared at the imposing, worn-out building, shrouded in a mist that seemed to come out of nowhere. The old, rusted sign still swayed, displaying the faded letters of the name that once welcomed travelers. Hillview Motel, barely legible. The light drizzle mixed with the scent of wet earth, and the place looked abandoned for decades, waiting for us, or for something hiding inside. I got out of the car and felt the cold wind hit my face. This is it, I thought. We were there for fun, but the feeling that we were about to step into something far bigger than we imagined was undeniable. What could go wrong? It was just an old building, right? Yet as we walked toward the motel's entrance, it was impossible to ignore that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. Each step toward the entrance felt heavier. The wind sliced through the silence, bringing with it a strange murmur, almost as if the motel itself was whispering to us. When we reached the main door, which was partially hanging off its hinges, Lucas gave it a push, clearing the way inside. The wood creaked in protest, and the sound echoed through the empty lobby, as if the building hadn't had visitors in a long time. The interior was exactly as the legends described: abandoned, decayed, and terrifying. The place seemed frozen in time, with furniture covered in dust and torn curtains trembling in the windows. The air was thick with the smell of mold, but there was something else, an indescribable feeling that took hold of us as we explored the lobby. The silence was so intense that we could hear our own footsteps echoing, and for some reason, it made me uncomfortable. Lucas and Nick laughed nervously, trying to keep things light, but I could feel the tension in the air. I was nervous too, though I tried not to show it. There was something about this place that was messing with us in a way none of us expected. Lucas made a joke about it being a perfect horror movie set, but his eyes kept darting around, as if he were expecting something to suddenly appear. Something that didn't belong here. Do you think anyone's ever gotten stuck here? I asked aloud, trying to give voice to my unease. No one answered. Just quick, worried glances were exchanged before Nick forced a smile. We knew the place had a reputation for being cursed, for making people disappear, but it was just a legend, right? Maybe we were just being paranoid. Or maybe we were already feeling the influence of whatever inhabited those walls. As we ventured deeper into the motel, a chill crept up my spine. It wasn't the cold or the darkness. It was the sense that the building itself was watching us, as if something was hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but it was there, lurking. And as we moved through the hallways, the feeling only grew stronger. The corridor leading to the rooms was long and dark, the walls stained with dampness and covered in graffiti left by previous intruders. The faint glow of our flashlights barely illuminated the path ahead, casting shadows that shifted as we walked. With each step, the sound of our shoes echoed, and the air felt heavy, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake the feeling that we were being watched, but it was almost tangible. We stopped in front of the first room. The door was partially open, hanging from one of its hinges, and inside we could see a rusted spring bed. the mattress torn and overturned. The room looked like it had been ransacked long ago, with broken furniture and shattered mirrors. But what caught my attention the most was the smell. A strong, rotting odor, as if something had died there, hidden in the dark corners that our flashlights couldn't reach. Lucas was the first to step inside, laughing nervously as he swept the room with his flashlight. "It's not as bad as I thought," he said, trying to sound casual, but I could see the discomfort on his face. Nick stayed by the door, glancing back occasionally as if expecting something, or someone, to appear in the hallway. I understood. Even deserted, the place gave us the strange feeling that we weren't alone. We explored a few more rooms, and they all looked the same. Destroyed beds, scattered furniture, clear signs of abandonment. Yet the further we went, the more the tension grew. It felt like the motel was slowly closing in on us, becoming more oppressive. An invisible weight seemed to hang over our shoulders, making each step harder. I could see that Lucas and Nick felt it too, but no one said anything. When we reached the last room at the end of the hallway, something changed. The door was locked, which was odd since all the others had been open or broken. Nick tried forcing the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "There must be something inside," he said, trying to sound excited, but the hesitation in his voice was clear. Lucas shrugged and suggested we leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what was in there. We went back to the lobby to look for something to pry the door open, and that's when Nick found something unexpected. On the reception desk, half hidden under a pile of yellowed papers, was a leather-bound notebook. "Check this out," he said, pulling out the dusty object. He flipped through a few pages quickly, and I could see they were old guest records, dating back many years. But something was off. All the entries were from a single day. One after the other, every name, every arrival was recorded on the same day, as if everyone had arrived together. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, taking the notebook from Nick's hands. The last page was stamped with a red mark that said, "Closed." The words, "last stay," seemed to have been hastily scribbled by someone. There was something sinister about it. It was as if the notebook was warning us that something terrible had happened there. Lucas laughed nervously. "Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe they closed it that same day," he said, trying to sound calm, but the silence between us said otherwise. I flipped through the notebook again, and one detail stood out. No guest had ever checked out. There were no departures recorded, only arrivals. It was as if everyone had simply vanished. That sent a chill down my spine, and I realized we were dealing with something far stranger than just a local legend. We left the notebook on the counter and kept exploring. As we walked, the weight of that discovery seemed to follow us. It felt like the notebook had released something the motel had been trying to keep hidden. The already oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, and with each passing minute, the tension mounted. The wind outside howled through the broken windows, and the sound of the rain seemed to intensify, as if the weather was conspiring to keep us there. Lucas suggested we check the rooms upstairs. I didn't want to go, but I also didn't want to be the only one to show fear. We agreed to keep going, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. Whatever had happened at that motel was starting to wrap itself around us. As soon as we climbed the spiral staircase to the second floor, something began to happen. The sound of a door slamming echoed through the hallways, followed by another, and then another. Lucas stopped, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. I nodded, but none of us moved. The sound of the doors closing by themselves reverberated through the hallway, like a clear warning that we weren't welcome there. The first door we checked was locked tight. There was no wind, no draft to explain what was happening. Every single door in the rooms, which had been open or hanging off their hinges, was now firmly shut. One by one, we started trying to open them, but they were all inexplicably sealed. Nick began to panic, yanking at the handles harder than necessary. I could feel the panic rising in me too. Suddenly, the sound of another door slamming closer echoed again. This time so loud it seemed to happen right behind us. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. No sign of movement, no presence. Just the sound of doors that were now all closed. "Someone's here," I muttered, barely able to hide the fear in my voice. Lucas and Nick didn't argue. We all knew something was wrong, something beyond our control. The sound of doors slamming seemed to grow, as if the entire building was conspiring to make us run. And that's exactly what we started doing. We bolted back toward the lobby, our flashlights bouncing as we rushed down the stairs. Deep down, we all knew the fun of this exploration was over. The motel was toying with us. And the worst part, it seemed to be winning. When we finally reached the lobby, we tried to open the front door, but it was locked. Lucas pulled at the handle with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked, how?" The question hung in the air. We knew the door wasn't locked when we entered, but now it seemed like the motel wanted to keep us there. Panic washed over us like a wave. We tried to think logically, but it was hard to think clearly with the rising tension. That's when a sound pierced the air, a phone ringing. We stopped and looked at each other, confused. There was no power in the motel, no reason a phone should be working. Yet the persistent ringing continued, coming from one of the rooms off the lobby. "Someone's messing with us," Lucas said, trying to sound brave, but his voice betrayed the fear. We followed the sound to a room beside the reception, where we found an old, dusty phone on the bedside table. The ringing stopped as soon as we entered. Nick looked at us, his hands shaking. "This doesn't make sense," he said, but no one answered. I slowly approached the phone, a part of me thinking it was better to just leave it alone. But as if drawn by an invisible force, I picked up the receiver. Before I could say anything, a calm, distorted voice echoed on the other end. "Would you like to extend your stay?" It was a simple question, but the way it was said chilled me to the bone. I dropped the phone immediately, and it went silent again, as if nothing had happened. "There's someone here. We're not alone," Nick said, his voice shaking. I agreed. There was no denying anymore that whatever was in that motel was toying with us. We needed to leave, and fast. We rushed back to the reception, but the door was still locked. Lucas kept yanking at it, while Nick searched for something to break the lock. The claustrophobia started to set in. The motel, which had once been just an abandoned building, now felt like a predator, slowly closing in on us. "We're trapped here," I whispered, more to myself than to them, but they both heard me. While Lucas continued struggling with the door, we heard a new sound. A creaking coming from the main hallway. Something was moving in the shadows. "What was that?" I asked, feeling the panic rise in my throat. Nick turned quickly, his flashlight pointing down the empty hallway. Nothing, just the distant sound of something scraping across the floor. And then, a loud crack. Something had definitely moved. "Let's go out the window," I suggested, pointing to a dirty window that led to the side of the building. Without thinking twice, we began breaking it open, feeling the pressure build. The sound of something dragging behind us grew louder, but I didn't want to look back. Finally, the glass shattered, and we started squeezing through the opening, one by one. As soon as we were outside, we ran without looking back. The forest around the motel was thick, but it didn't matter. We just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. The rain had picked up, and the mud slowed us down as we ran between the trees. Lucas was ahead, with Nick right behind him, and I struggled not to fall behind, feeling my heart race with every step. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stopped to catch our breath. We looked at each other, exhausted and terrified. The motel was still visible between the trees, its sinister silhouette standing out against the dark sky. "Never again," Nick muttered, panting. Lucas nodded silently, and I just stood there, trying to comprehend what we had just experienced. Whatever was inside that place didn't belong to us, and now we knew that. We felt like we had gotten far enough away, but the fear lingered. The silence in the forest was unsettling, as if nature itself had gone quiet after our escape. We were safe, but still, the feeling of being watched remained. I didn't know if it was just my brain trying to process what had happened, or if something was actually following us. But whatever it was, I didn't want to find out. Even days later, the feeling that something had been left unfinished at the motel still haunted me. Coming back home should have been the end of the story, but in truth, it felt like it was just the beginning. Every time I lay down to sleep, I heard those sounds again. The phone ringing, the doors slamming, and that voice asking about the stay. It was as if the motel had been etched into my mind, calling me back, but I knew I'd never return. Lucas and Nick seemed to be going through the same thing. We spoke little about what happened, and when we did, it was as if none of us really knew what to say. What happened there? Who was trying to trap us? And why? These are questions that will probably never have answers, and maybe it's better that way. The mystery of the abandoned motel will remain forever, but the truth is, we couldn't completely leave it behind. Something from that place followed us, even if only in our minds. Now, whenever I'm alone, I feel a presence. Something that's always lurking, always watching. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I can almost hear that phone ringing again. I've always been the kind of guy who loved a good adventure, exploring abandoned places, feeling the adrenaline of being in a space that had seen better days but was now in total decay. It was almost like a hobby for me and my friends. But that afternoon, when we decided to explore the old cement factory on the outskirts of town, I had no idea that this adventure would be different from all the others. To this day, I wonder if we should have just turned back the moment we crossed those rusted gates. My name is Mike, and I've always been the leader of the group. I was the one who came up with the crazy ideas and risky adventures, and of course, my friends always ended up following along. That afternoon, we were bored and looking for something different to do. That's when Ben suggested we check out the abandoned cement factory outside town. The place had a reputation for being a hotspot for graffiti and rubble, perfect for photos and videos, so naturally, it seemed like the ideal spot to kill a few hours. The factory was in a secluded area, surrounded by trees and hills that shielded it from prying eyes. By the time we got there, the sun was starting to set, and the place looked even more eerie than I had imagined. The enormous chimneys, once towering and imposing, now looked like ghosts of industrialization, covered in rust and worn down by time. The silence was almost deafening. There was nothing but the sound of our own footsteps and the wind whistling through the empty corridors. Ben, Jack, and I exchanged quick glances before heading toward the main entrance, a partially rusted metal door that groaned as we pushed it open. As soon as we stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. The air inside the factory was heavy, filled with dust and the smell of mold. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the floor was littered with debris. Pieces of old machinery, remnants of cement bags, and empty paint cans. We started walking through the corridors with our flashlights, shining them into the dark corners and recording everything on our phones. Up to that point, it seemed like just another exploration, like so many others. But little did we know that as we ventured deeper into that factory, we were about to discover something that would make us question if going in there had been the worst decision of our lives. Walking into that factory felt like stepping into another world. Natural light barely filtered through the dirty, broken windows, and our footsteps echoed through the empty hallways. As we moved forward, our eyes were constantly drawn to the details left behind. Rusted tools, toppled chairs, and old documents scattered across the floor, all covered in a thick layer of dust. It seemed as though the place had been abandoned in a hurry, like something had forced everyone to leave suddenly. Jack, ever curious, ran over to a set of old control panels and began playing with the rusted buttons. "You think this still works?" he asked, a mischievous grin on his face. "I doubt it," I replied, laughing as he pretended to pull a lever. Nothing happened, of course. The factory was dead, just like the machines that once operated there. Ben, however, was quieter than usual. He walked a bit ahead, shining his handheld flashlight into the darker areas. As we continued down the corridors, something began to bother me. The place was too quiet, even for an abandoned factory. There was an odd feeling in the air, like we were being watched. I tried to shake off the thought, assuming it was just my imagination playing tricks on me because of the place's eerie atmosphere. But then I realized I wasn't the only one feeling it. Ben suddenly stopped and turned to me. "Did you notice that?" he asked, his voice low and tense. "Notice what?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "The footprints on the floor," he replied, pointing his flashlight at the dusty ground. I looked down and saw exactly what he meant. There were footprints that didn't belong to us. They were fresh, much fresher than anything else in that place. "Someone's been here," Jack murmured, his unease evident in his voice. My heart started to beat a little faster. Who else would be walking around in there? And why? We decided to keep going, but now with much more caution. Every step felt heavier, and the silence of the place became more and more oppressive. Something was wrong, and we all could feel it. As we ventured deeper into the factory, faint echoes of distant voices began to reach us. At first, they were soft whispers, almost indistinguishable, but they were there. I looked at my friends, and the fear in their eyes reflected my own. Whatever it was, we weren't alone anymore. The voices became clearer as we approached a larger room, with high ceilings and rusted beams. "Are you hearing that?" Jack asked, his voice shaking with nerves. We all heard it. Voices, mixed with the sound of something being moved, like people were working or talking inside. I stopped for a moment, trying to figure out what was going on. After all, the factory had been abandoned for years, so who could possibly be there? Carefully, we entered the room, and what we saw left me speechless. In the center of the room, covered by dirty, heavy tarps, were modern-looking pieces of equipment. Large crates, metal drums, and tools that seemed entirely out of place in such an old building. Ben slowly approached and pulled back one of the tarps. Underneath were generators and boxes with logos I didn't recognize. "What is this?" I asked, trying to process what we were seeing. Jack's eyes widened as he looked around. "This doesn't seem right. Someone's using this place." The reality started to settle in. The factory wasn't as abandoned as we thought, and whatever was happening there, it was clear they didn't want anyone else to find out. We had stumbled upon something we weren't supposed to see. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep the rising panic under control. But before we could even plan our escape, the sound of footsteps began to echo from the corridors we had come from. Deep, serious male voices were approaching, and fear took over us. "Shit, they're coming," Jack whispered, frantically looking around for a place to hide. We all froze for a second, our eyes meeting, sharing the same thought. We needed to hide, and fast. Panic set in as the men got closer. Their voices were firm, and their footsteps echoed through the dark corridors of the factory. There was no doubt they were heading straight for us. Without time to think, we all rushed to the darkest corner of the room, hiding behind a pile of boxes and tarps. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound as I listened to the footsteps drawing nearer. Ben, next to me, was tense, his eyes wide with fear. "They can't find us," he whispered, almost without a voice. I nodded, fully aware that if these guys found us, it wouldn't end well. The sound of footsteps suddenly stopped, and we heard one of the men speaking, but we couldn't make out the words. They were talking about something. I couldn't help but wonder what they would do if they realized we had been snooping around and seen what we weren't supposed to. Jack was sweating, the fear clear on his face. The silence was heavy, and I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. We could hear them rustling the tarps, the muffled sound of boxes being opened and closed. They were checking the equipment. "We have to get out of here," I whispered to the others. But before we could move, the sound of a tarp being yanked violently echoed through the room, and one of the crates next to us was knocked to the ground. They were too close. Without warning, one of the men moved even closer to where we were hiding. He stopped, looked around, and for a second, I thought he was going to see us. My entire body was tense, bracing for the worst. Then, the sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. One of the men quickly answered, and the voice of the other began to fade as they walked away. We exchanged quick glances. It was our chance to escape. Adrenaline surged through me as I signaled for the others to run. We couldn't wait any longer. If they found us, we knew we'd be in serious trouble. I stood up as quietly as I could, and we started moving toward the exit, crouched behind the boxes, trying not to make any noise. The men's voices continued, but they seemed distracted by the phone call. This was our only shot. Suddenly, Jack tripped over one of the stacked boxes, and the sound echoed through the room. We all froze. In a matter of seconds, the voices stopped, and the footsteps resumed, faster and heavier this time. "Hey, someone's there!" one of the men shouted, and at that moment, we knew we'd been caught. Without thinking twice, we bolted toward the corridor we had come from, their angry voices echoing behind us. The chase was on. My heart pounded in my chest as we raced through the dark corridors of the factory. The sound of our footsteps, mixed with those of the men chasing us, created a cacophony that only increased my anxiety. Ben was just ahead of me, and I could hear Jack right behind me, panting heavily. The factory lights were dim and flickered occasionally, casting moving shadows at every turn. The place felt like a maze, and with each corner we turned, the exit seemed further away. The chase continued, and the men weren't far behind. "This way," Ben shouted, rounding a corner and leading us into a side room we hadn't noticed before. We rushed inside, slamming the door behind us and pushing an old table against it to block it. We were all gasping for air, our bodies trembling with adrenaline and fear. We could hear the men on the other side of the door, their footsteps getting closer. I tried to calm myself, but the reality was that we were trapped. There was no other way out of the room. "This can't be happening," Jack muttered, looking around, desperately searching for an exit. The panic on his face mirrored what we were all feeling. I scanned the room and noticed a small window high up on the wall, leading outside the factory. "There," I pointed, and without wasting time, we started moving toward the window, knowing it was our last chance to escape. The window was small but big enough for us to squeeze through one by one. Ben was the first to climb up the stacked crates to reach it. He pried the window open with difficulty, his movements quick and precise as he forced it open. The cool night air rushed into the stuffy room, bringing a faint sense of hope. Jack was next to climb up, while I stayed by the door, listening to the footsteps growing closer and closer. When Jack made it through the window, it was my turn. We could hear the men trying to force the door open, pushing against the table. The wood creaked, and I looked back for a brief second. The men were almost inside, and we were out of time. My heart raced as I pulled myself through the window, landing on the dirt outside with a thud. There was no time to stop. As soon as we hit the ground, we ran along the side of the factory, trying to get as far away from the entrance as possible. Our breathing was fast, and the sound of our footsteps echoed in the dark night. I could still hear the men yelling behind us, their voices filled with anger. We knew we couldn't stop running. Every second we spent there was a risk of being caught. Ben led the way, with Jack and me following closely behind. We ran until our legs burned and our lungs begged for air. We only stopped when we reached a dense area of trees, far enough from the factory. We collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, but relieved to be alive. "We made it," Ben said between deep breaths. The adrenaline was still coursing through my body, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. But the relief of escaping the factory quickly mixed with another feeling. The sense that even though we were far away, we still weren't safe. As we rested, we tried to make sense of what we had seen inside. "Those guys, what were they doing there?" Jack asked, still catching his breath. "It wasn't just an abandoned factory. They were using it for something," Ben added, the unease in his voice making it clear he was just as confused as we were. The images of the modern equipment hidden under the tarps kept playing in my head. The place was much more than a forgotten factory. Something illegal was going on there, and we had seen too much. "We have to tell someone," I said, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. If we told the police, we'd have to admit we trespassed. Plus, those men clearly didn't want to be found. Whoever they were, they wouldn't hesitate to make sure no one discovered what was happening there. "If we tell anyone, we're in danger," Ben replied, with a serious look on his face. "They saw us. They know who we are." A heavy silence fell over us. We knew we were in a tough situation. The decision to stay quiet seemed like the safest option, but at the same time, the fear of something worse happening weighed on us. "What if they come after us?" Jack asked, breaking the silence. The thought of being hunted down by those men, of becoming targets for seeing something we shouldn't have, made my skin crawl. There were no easy answers. We decided that, for now, we'd stay quiet. That night would be a secret between us. We promised not to tell anyone what we had found. But deep down, we all knew this wasn't a final decision. Whatever was going on in that factory wasn't something we could just forget, and I had a feeling that this story wasn't over. The following days were strange. I tried to go on with my life as usual, but the cement factory never left my mind. I kept replaying those moments of panic, and every time I thought about what we had seen, my stomach turned. Ben and Jack were different, too. We didn't talk about what happened anymore, but I knew they were just as worried as I was. The factory, the men, the equipment, it all felt like a nightmare we couldn't leave behind. The tension grew every time I was home alone. Every time I heard a car drive by, I thought it could be them. My nerves were on edge. I knew we needed to stay away from all of it, but a part of me still wanted answers. Why were they using that factory? What were they doing there? And why did it seem so important for them to keep it a secret? These questions continued to haunt me. A month later, while trying to get back into my routine, I received a message on my phone. The number was unknown. When I opened it, my heart stopped for a moment. "Forget what you saw." That was all it said. My fingers went cold, and the feeling of danger returned full force. I stared at the screen for a while, unsure of what to do. Somehow, those men knew who we were, and they knew we hadn't forgotten. The fear came flooding back. I immediately deleted the message, but the damage was already done. The cement factory still haunted me, and now, more than ever, I knew this wasn't over. They were still out there, and whatever they were doing, they would do anything to protect their secret. At that moment, I realized the danger had never really gone away. It had just been waiting, watching, ready to strike. Exploring abandoned places has always been one of my favorite activities. Ever since I heard about the old school, closed down years ago after a fire, it became my next target. I couldn't resist. I'd heard stories of how the place was engulfed in flames on a stormy night, but what truly drew me in were the rumors that the building still held strange remnants of that day. I decided I was going to find out for myself what was inside. My name is Ryan, and I'm the kind of guy who's always looking for adventure, even if it means breaking a few rules. I knew exploring that school was dangerous, but the thrill of discovering something interesting was too strong to ignore. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was determined to get inside that building. Warnings be damned. I grabbed my flashlight, threw my backpack over my shoulder, and headed to the abandoned school at the end of the street. Reaching the rusted gate wasn't hard. The fences had fallen in some spots, making it easy to slip through. As I walked across the empty courtyard, I took in the sight of the main building. Its walls were scarred by time and the fire, leaving blackened marks on the bricks and broken windows. The place radiated desolation, but there was something more, a deep, eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air. When I approached the main entrance, I pushed the heavy door. It groaned in protest, but eventually gave way. I stepped in cautiously, flashlight in hand, illuminating the dark hallway. The smell of mold and burnt wood hit me immediately. The walls were covered in ash and soot, and the floor creaked under my every step. Something told me that the deeper I ventured into the school, the more I'd find. More than just ruins. The air inside felt thick, and a sense of unease began to settle in me. I knew I was alone, but the atmosphere was suffocating. The fire might have happened years ago, but something unexplainable still seemed to linger here. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of an afternoon I would never forget. As I walked through the darkened corridors, it was hard not to imagine what the place must have been like before the fire. The beam of my flashlight danced across the soot-covered walls, revealing recent graffiti mixed with old burn marks. The floor was littered with debris, broken wood, shattered glass, but something immediately caught my attention. The chalkboards. They were still there, in nearly every room. What was strange was what was written on them. Handwritten messages, scrawled in chalk, as if someone had been there recently. Fragmented phrases like, "Why us?" and "Get out," sent a chill down my spine. Some were partially erased, while others looked so fresh I could almost feel the chalk dust in the air. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos, sensing that these words weren't random. There was something desperate about the way they were written. I kept walking, moving from room to room. Most were in ruins, with overturned desks and partially collapsed walls. But I couldn't shake the feeling those chalkboards left in me. In one of the classrooms, I found old notebooks on the floor, still open, as if they'd been left in the middle of a lesson. I picked one up. The pages were yellowed, and the drawings inside were disturbing. Twisted human figures, confused scribbles, and what looked like the face of a child, but with its eyes erased. It was as if the students who once studied here had been touched by something dark. I was starting to feel uncomfortable. The air was heavier now, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I decided to keep moving, but instead of relief, the tension only increased with each step. And that's when I heard something that shouldn't have been there. Laughter. Children's laughter, echoing through the empty hallways, as if kids were playing around me. But I knew that was impossible. No one else was here, or so I thought. I stopped for a moment, listening intently. The sound seemed to come from further ahead, reverberating through the walls. My hands started to sweat, but I decided to keep going. I tried to convince myself that the echoes of laughter were just the wind passing through the corridors, but my heart was racing. Something was very wrong with this place, and I hadn't figured out what yet. The laughter continued, echoing from a distance, but now it had a sharper, almost mocking tone. Each step I took seemed to push the sound further away, as if it was teasing me, daring me to go deeper into this maze of dark corridors. I began to wonder if my mind was playing tricks on me, a reaction to the oppressive silence and the growing fear. But something inside me told me it wasn't my imagination, that laughter was real. I turned left into a hallway that led to the more distant classrooms. Here, the smell of burnt wood was stronger, and the damage to the building was worse. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving a trail of rubble that made it hard to walk. Every step I took stirred up a thin layer of dust, filling the air and making me cough. The place was becoming more claustrophobic, and my flashlight didn't seem strong enough to cut through the darkness ahead. Then, as I rounded another corner, I came upon something that made my heart skip a beat. One of the classrooms was perfectly arranged, with chairs lined up in neat rows, as if a class were about to begin. It was as though time had frozen in this room. The chairs were flawlessly aligned. The chalkboard was clean and empty, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. None of this made sense. Who would have set everything up like this? I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind searched for a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Maybe someone was using the place, but why would they organize a classroom in an abandoned, condemned building? The discomfort took hold of me again, and I knew it was time to get out. But before I could turn back, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Light footsteps, like children running down the hallway. But, once again, no one was in sight. Panic began to set in, and I knew that if I didn't leave soon, something bad was going to happen. The footsteps grew louder, as if the children were running all around me, even though I couldn't see anything. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the sound was too real, too close to ignore. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the panic was rising. The pristine classroom in front of me, with its perfectly arranged chairs, felt like a scene from a nightmare. This wasn't normal, not in a building abandoned for years. I decided it was time to leave. I turned on my heel and started walking toward the exit, my hands trembling as I held the flashlight. With each step I took, the sounds seemed to intensify. The children's laughter echoed again, now closer, almost mocking me. I didn't know what was happening, but my instincts were screaming at me to run. Yet, despite my desire to flee, my legs felt heavy, as if something invisible was holding me there. I turned down another hallway, trying to remember the way I'd come in. The school was a maze, and the darkness only made it worse. The soot-stained walls and broken doors of the classrooms made me feel like I was in a place forgotten by time. But with every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I knew I wasn't alone. Something, or someone, was following me. And then, I heard a sound that made my entire body freeze. A voice whispering my name. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to echo in the hallways. The voice had been clear, almost familiar. Ryan. It was as if someone was calling to me, trying to lure me deeper into this cursed place. I looked around, but there was no one. I was completely alone, or at least that's what I wanted to believe. Fear started to take over, and for the first time, I felt I was in real danger. On edge, I kept walking, now faster, almost running. The laughter had stopped, but the sound of footsteps followed close behind. It felt like something was chasing me down the corridors. The exit was close. I just needed to find the right path. And in a last attempt to stay calm, I forced myself to believe it was all just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something very real was happening. With my heart racing and fear coursing through my veins, I focused on what mattered, getting out as fast as possible. The hallways seemed endless, and the darkness enveloped every corner of the school. The fire-scarred walls felt like they were closing in around me, and my flashlight no longer seemed enough to cut through the suffocating blackness. Each step I took echoed louder, as if the building itself was amplifying the sound of my footsteps. Then, something changed. The sound of footsteps following me had disappeared. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I was safe, that this was all just an illusion brought on by my fear. But when I looked down the hallway, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, in the distance, at the exit I had been searching for, stood a shadow. A small, undefined figure, motionless, staring in my direction. Whatever courage I had left vanished. I didn't know what to do. Should I run or confront it? Stand still or move forward? Before I could decide, the figure moved, slowly, as if gliding across the floor. My entire body went cold. It wasn't a person, not a normal one at least. The shape was distorted, partially hidden in the shadows that filled the hallway. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Suddenly, I heard the laughter again, that same eerie laughter that had followed me from the start. But this time, it was all around me. It was as if the building itself was laughing, mocking my fear. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to focus. I had to get out, no matter what that shadow was. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Summoning the last of my courage, I ran toward the exit. I didn't care about the noises or the shadows around me. All that mattered was getting out of that hellish building. The doors were just ahead, and I knew that once I was outside, the terror consuming me would start to fade. At least, that's what I hoped. I reached the exit, my heart pounding. The door was right in front of me, the only thing between me and freedom from this nightmare. I was so close I could almost feel the fresh air outside. I reached out, grabbing the cold doorknob. For a moment, everything went silent, like the building was holding its breath. But when I twisted the knob, I felt resistance. The door was locked. My heart sank. How could it be locked? It had been open when I came in. I pulled on the door with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. The silence that had once offered some relief was now replaced by an oppressive presence. Something was terribly wrong. My eyes darted around, searching for another way out, but the hallway around me seemed to be closing in. I needed to get out of there. That's when I looked at one of the nearby windows, and in the reflection, I saw something that made me freeze in place. Children, what looked like children, were standing behind me. Their faces were pale, almost transparent, and their eyes were empty, devoid of life. I knew that if I turned around, I wouldn't like what I saw. Every instinct in me screamed not to look, but curiosity, or maybe fear, got the better of me. I slowly turned my head and saw nothing. The hallway was empty. The figures I had seen in the reflection were simply gone. I took a deep breath, trying to control the panic rising in me. The window was my last chance. Without hesitation, I ran toward it, ignoring the pain in my hands as I forced the cracked glass open. I didn't care about the cuts or the cold air outside. All that mattered was escaping. With the window open, I didn't think twice. I climbed onto the ledge, feeling the cool night breeze on my skin, a sensation that should have calmed me, but it didn't. My eyes scanned the empty schoolyard. It wasn't a high drop, but I knew I'd have to jump. The fear of getting hurt was insignificant compared to the fear of whatever I had seen, or thought I'd seen, inside the school. I took a deep breath and prepared to jump. That's when I heard it again, laughter. But this time, it was closer, as if it were coming from directly behind me. I turned quickly, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw shadows moving through the hallway. My entire body was paralyzed with terror. The laughter was now accompanied by whispers, words I couldn't understand, but they left me with the distinct feeling that whatever it wasn't of this world. The shadows crept closer, slowly, as if they were surrounding me. In a final, desperate move, I jumped out the window, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through my legs, but I didn't stop. I rolled to the side and got up, running as fast as I could toward the exit of the property. My legs burned. My breath was ragged, but I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. The sound of laughter echoed in my mind, pushing me to run even faster. I reached the rusted gate, the same one I'd slipped through hours earlier, though now it felt like miles away. I used the last of my strength to squeeze through the fallen fence, finally making it to the street. The world outside felt different, darker, heavier. There was no more thrill of adventure, just the relief of being far from that cursed place. Even outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly safe. The laughter still echoed in my mind, and the sense of being watched didn't go away. I hurried down the empty street, the silence of the night only heightening my paranoia. I looked back one last time, seeing the dark silhouette of the school fading into the distance. I was glad to be far from it, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not for me. I got home late, exhausted and still trembling. I slammed the door shut, locking every lock and throwing myself onto the couch, trying to steady my breathing. But peace didn't come. I knew that no matter how far away I was from that school, something had followed me, and I got proof of that later that same night. As I lay in bed, trying to drown out the echoes of the laughter, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound was too clear. Laughter. It echoed inside my room. I opened my eyes and sat up, heart pounding. The room was dark, but the sound was unmistakable. The same children's laughter I had heard in the school. I covered my ears, wishing it would stop, but the laughter didn't fade. It was there, with me, even now, in the safety of my own home. I jumped up, desperate, trying to find the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Nothing but shadows and silence. The laughter had vanished as quickly as it came, but something inside me told me this wasn't over. I knew that no matter how hard I tried to forget, the abandoned school had left its mark. The laughter would never truly stop. And in that moment, I realized that the nightmare that began that dark afternoon would follow me forever. I've always been fascinated by abandoned places, especially those that carry dark, forgotten histories. Photographing these places was my favorite hobby, and the old psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of the city seemed like the perfect setting. When I decided to explore it, I knew it would be a unique experience, but I wasn't prepared for what I'd encounter that night. The hospital, with its crumbling walls and broken windows, held much more than just memories. That exploration would turn into something I still can't forget. My name is Emily, and ever since I was young, I've been passionate about photography. I love capturing the essence of forgotten places, the ones people tend to avoid. That afternoon, I grabbed my camera and drove to the abandoned psychiatric hospital, an old building that had been closed for decades. I arrived just before sunset, and the gray sky matched the decaying atmosphere of the building perfectly. The outer walls were covered in moss, and the shattered windows gave a grim view of the inside. I knew the place had a macabre history. There had been reports of patient disappearances in its final years of operation, and some claimed their spirits still roamed the halls. I admit, stories like that never scared me. On the contrary, they only fueled my curiosity. With my camera in hand, I started exploring the hospital. The doors were open, or at least, what was left of them. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I entered, and the smell of mold filled the air. As I stepped into the first hallway, the darkness began to settle in with the arrival of night. The long shadows on the walls seemed to dance with every movement of my flashlight, and I wondered how many people had walked these halls before. The atmosphere was heavy, and every photo I took seemed to capture a small piece of the pain and suffering that lingered in the air. Old medical files lay scattered on the floor, and objects like worn-out toys and patient clothes were still strewn in the corners, as if the hospital had been abandoned in a hurry. As I walked deeper into the corridors, I felt a chill run down my spine, a sensation I couldn't shake. Something about this place felt wrong, but at the same time, I couldn't stop taking photos. A mix of fear and fascination kept me there, as though I was somehow connected to the hospital in a way I couldn't explain. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of the strange sensations I would experience that night. As I walked down the oppressive hallways, the silence of the hospital seemed to swallow the sound of my footsteps. The deeper I went, the denser the air felt, as if time itself had stopped inside those walls. My boots echoed through the dust-covered floor, and each click of the camera reverberated through the empty building. I captured images of everything I could: scattered medical records, old chairs coated in dust, and even worn-out stuffed toys that somehow still survived the passage of time. While photographing a room with broken windows, I heard the first sound. It was distant, like something being dragged across the floor somewhere ahead in the corridors. I froze, my eyes fixed on the empty hallway in front of me. The sound was faint but distinct, like metal scraping against concrete. I stood still, waiting for it to stop, but it persisted, coming from somewhere deeper inside the hospital. My heart started to race, but I tried to calm myself. It must be the wind, I thought. The winds outside were strong, and the old building had many vulnerable spots where a draft could easily cause a sound like that. I refocused and continued taking pictures, but now there was something different in my demeanor. The atmosphere of the place, once intriguing and mysterious, was becoming oppressive. It felt as though the hospital was starting to respond to my presence, as if it knew I was there. I decided to ignore the sound and continued exploring the corridors. I passed rusted metal doors, each of them marked with visible signs of wear and decay, and kept capturing images. But with each click of the camera, it felt like the hospital responded with a dark echo, and the dragging sound continued in the background, always distant but growing more persistent. I started to feel like I was being watched. The sense that something was wrong intensified. It was a mix of instinct and intuition, something deep inside telling me I should leave, but curiosity kept me going. I kept walking, searching for the next interesting spot to photograph. But as I moved forward, the sound that had once been faint started to grow louder. With every step I took, the noise seemed closer, and now it was unmistakable. Something, or someone, was moving inside the hospital. My heart raced when I realized the dragging sound was no longer just an echo in the distance. It now felt like it was only a few meters away, reverberating through the corridors. My mind tried to come up with rational explanations. Maybe the wind was moving something inside, or maybe a window had come loose in the storm outside. But as these thoughts ran through my head, a growing sense of panic began to take over. Something was wrong, and I knew it. Despite the fear tightening in my chest, I decided to approach the sound. I followed the noise, my steps becoming more cautious. The hospital seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, with hallways that curved and disappeared into the darkness. The daylight was fading, and the place grew more claustrophobic by the minute. I began to wonder if I was going too far. The sound, however, continued, and now it seemed to be coming from one of the rooms ahead. I approached a half-open door from where the noise seemed to be coming. It was partially stuck, but with a gentle push, I managed to open it completely. Inside, I found a scene that made me question what was happening in this place. There was a hospital bed in the center of the room, and it looked like it had been moved recently. The wheels were misaligned, and there were marks on the floor as if someone had dragged the bed from one side to the other. My first thought was that maybe someone else had been there, another explorer, or perhaps even homeless people seeking shelter in the abandoned hospital. But the room was eerily clean, at least compared to the rest of the building. That made me even more uneasy. Who would have moved the bed, and why? Before I could dwell on the thought any longer, a new sound echoed through the hallway, louder and closer than before. It was the same dragging noise, but now it seemed to come directly from the corridor I had just walked down. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I decided it was time to get out of the hospital, but as I neared the exit, I realized things were about to get much worse. With my heart pounding, I realized I'd spent enough time there. I grabbed my camera and started walking quickly back down the corridor, heading toward the main exit. The hospital, which had once fascinated me with its decay and history, now felt suffocating with every step I took. The sounds echoing through the halls wouldn't stop haunting me, and all I wanted was to leave as fast as possible. When I reached the heavy metal door I'd used to enter, I felt a momentary wave of relief. But when I tried to open it, that relief turned into panic. The heavy metal door, which had been opened before, was now firmly locked. I pulled the handle hard, but it wouldn't budge. I stood there for a few seconds, stunned, staring at the door, unable to comprehend what was happening. I was sure I hadn't closed it, and who else could have locked it? My panic began to rise, and a flood of confused thoughts invaded my mind. I tried to stay calm and think of another way out, but the fear was impossible to ignore. I looked around, searching for another solution. Daylight was fading fast, and the darkness was creeping into the corridors. I knew I had to act quickly before night fell completely. My hands were sweaty, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I remembered seeing a broken window in one of the nearby corridors, and I decided that might be my only chance to escape. Without wasting any more time, I ran toward the window. As I moved through the halls, the sounds seemed to follow me. The thuds and scratches I had tried to ignore now echoed even closer, as if something was chasing me through the shadows. Every step I took made the hospital feel more claustrophobic, as though the place was closing in on me. The doors were all shut, the windows covered in grime, and the sense that I was being watched grew stronger. My only goal was to reach that window and get out as fast as I could. Finally, I turned the corner and spotted the broken window. It was small and high off the ground, but it could work as an escape route. I approached cautiously, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. At this point, all I could think about was getting out. I grabbed a piece of wood from the floor and began clearing the remaining shards of glass from the frame, preparing to climb out. As I cleared the last pieces of glass, a chill ran down my spine. I paused for a moment, trying to understand what I was feeling. The hospital was enveloped in an eerie silence, almost surreal. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. But suddenly, the feeling of being watched returned with even greater intensity. Despite the silence, I knew something was there, watching me closely. I spun around abruptly, trying to see through the dark corridors. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the sensation of being observed was almost palpable. My mind began conjuring images of something hiding in the shadows, waiting to reveal itself. I forced myself to take a deep breath and keep going. I couldn't let fear paralyze me. Still, the thought that someone or something was following me, watching my every move, made me hesitate. It was as if those invisible eyes were pressuring me to leave, but at the same time, keeping me trapped there. With the window almost ready to be used as an escape, I grabbed my camera and took a few last shots of the hallway. Maybe, when I reviewed the images later, I'd discover what had caused this unsettling feeling. After the final click, I prepared to climb out the window. The darkness outside seemed more inviting than the one surrounding me inside the hospital. With every passing second, the feeling that something was about to happen intensified, as if a presence was silently approaching. Suddenly, a muffled noise echoed through the corridor. It sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was walking with extreme caution. My body froze for a moment, but I forced myself to continue. I couldn't waste any more time. I was determined to leave. I climbed onto the window frame, ignoring the remaining shards of glass, and began pulling myself through to the outside. But before I fully climbed out, I glanced back one last time. There, at the far end of the hallway, something moved. It wasn't a defined figure, more like a shadow that seemed to crawl along the walls, blending with the surroundings. My heart raced, and without a second thought, I jumped out the window, landing on the damp ground outside. I quickly stood up, ignoring the pain in my legs, and ran as fast as I could toward the rusted gate. When I finally passed through the rusted gate, my heart was still racing. The cold, damp night air felt much more welcoming than the suffocating atmosphere inside the hospital. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath and looked back, expecting to see something or someone following me, but everything was calm. The imposing building stood before me, with its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls, silent as if nothing had happened. Still, I knew something was wrong. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, even now that I was outside. I looked around, the darkness of the night blending with the shadows of the hospital, and no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, fear still dominated my thoughts. I ran my hands over my face, trying to calm down. I was out of that place, but the experience still weighed on me. I decided it was time to go home, try to forget what had happened, and review the photos later when my mind was clearer. I walked quickly to where I had parked my car, along the dirt road. The sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot and the distant howling wind accompanied my steps. Every sound, no matter how harmless, made my heart race again. When I reached the car, I unlocked the door in a hurry and got inside. As soon as I started the engine, a wave of relief washed over me, as if the car was my fortress against the world outside. But even with that brief sense of security, something still bothered me. As I drove away from the psychiatric hospital, I felt a sudden urge to check the rearview mirror. A part of me still needed to confirm if I was truly alone. My entire body tensed when, for a brief moment, I thought I saw something in the window on the second floor of the hospital. A shadow. It was almost imperceptible, but something was there. For a few seconds, I was paralyzed, staring at the mirror. Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? I didn't know anymore. I tried to shake the vision from my mind, but the feeling that something had watched me, that something had been aware of my presence in that place, stayed with me. I turned on the radio, trying to distract myself as I drove down the dark, empty road. The soft sound of music was comforting, but I knew that experience would stay etched in my memory for a long time. There were still unanswered questions, and the most disturbing one was, who, or what, had been there? When I finally got home, the feeling of safety was immediate, but not complete. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I reviewed the photos I'd taken. I downloaded the images onto my computer and, with trembling hands, began scrolling through them, reliving each moment inside the psychiatric hospital. At first, the photos seemed normal. Artistic shots of decaying hallways, old objects, and scattered medical files. But then, something caught my attention. In one of the photos, taken in the main corridor where I'd first heard the strange sounds, there was a small blur in the background. I zoomed in to see better. My heart froze. It was a shadow, barely visible, but it was there. The silhouette appeared to be standing at the end of the hallway, partially obscured by the darkness. My breathing became heavy, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. Could it just be a shadow created by the environment? I asked myself, trying to stay calm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I continued reviewing the photos, and in several others, the shadow appeared again. Sometimes in the corners of the images, sometimes further in the background, but always present. The feeling of being watched in the hospital now made sense. With each new photo that revealed the silhouette, my discomfort grew. The hospital wasn't empty, as I had imagined, and whatever it was, it hadn't just stayed there. It seemed to be following me. I stared at the last image for a few minutes. It was one of the bed I'd found moved. Right next to the bed, in the shadow of the wall, the silhouette was clearer now, almost human, but with features I couldn't make out. The only thing I could distinguish was what looked like a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness. Eyes that, somehow, were fixed on me. I immediately shut off the computer. I didn't want to see any more. I tried to brush off the growing fear, convincing myself that it was all just a coincidence. Maybe it was just a trick of the light in the photos, or my mind playing tricks on me. But even with all the rational explanations, I couldn't shake the image of those shadows from my mind. I spent the rest of the night awake, replaying each moment inside the psychiatric hospital, trying to understand what I had seen or felt. The next day, I decided to delete the photos. I didn't want to keep any memory of that night. Before deleting the files, however, I checked my phone. I knew I had taken a few photos with it as well, just to be safe. When I opened the gallery, I found an image I didn't remember taking. It was a photo of the hospital window, seen from inside. The silhouette was clearer than ever, and this time, it looked like it was smiling. I dropped the phone on my bed, my heart racing. I rushed to the window of my apartment and looked outside, just to make sure nothing was out of the ordinary. The world outside seemed normal. The sun was shining, and people were going about their day. But even with the normalcy around me, I felt that something wasn't right. I returned to my bed and picked up the phone again. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, coming from somewhere inside my apartment. "I'm watching you." It was the same voice I hadn't wanted to admit I'd heard at the hospital. The sensation of panic washed over me again, and in that moment, I knew that whatever I had felt in the hospital hadn't stayed there. Somehow, it had followed me home. And now, it didn't matter where I went. I knew I was being watched.